Felix, you work and research the Horn of Africa, and there are many issues with protests and also the public working with the government or not working with the government. Does what you're hearing, does that resonate for the Horn of Africa too?
It certainly does. I mean, one of the big concerns that we've seen since November in Oromia, which is Ethiopia's largest region, is that there's been widespread protests across that region, over 500 protests, and the vast majority of those protesters have been peaceful. Security forces have met those protests with just lethal force. We believe over 400 people have been killed. Many thousands have been detained. And one of the things that I constantly hear from the protesters is that they feel that they're alone in this struggle, that there's no one ever expresses concern over the abuses. The international community is silent, largely because they're very closely aligned with Ethiopia. And there's just no accountability. They know that nobody will ever hold those security officials to account. So I think when there are situations where other protesters show support in different contexts, that means a lot to people. I mean, I remember in January, for example, the European Parliament passed a very strong resolution on Ethiopia, and I was in an Oromo community at the time. And people were crying. I mean, this was the first time that they had actually seen that somebody was hearing their voices and that were showing some form of solidarity and sending the message that it's not okay to be shooting peaceful protesters in the streets.
You know, you raised a question there that's the same one that our community raised, and so I'll pass this to you, President Carter. Tam says, what kind of measures can be taken to make sure the Ethiopian government will compensate for innocent lives taken and be held accountable? What kinds of things can average everyday people or civil society do to help pressure governments in that direction? President?
Well, there's no doubt that the abandonment of the basic commitment to human rights by all the major parties that lead the world today has an adverse impact in a country like Ethiopia. We condemn any sort of human rights violations. It seems to me that the people in Oromia, which I think is the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, should have an equal right to speak out and become involved in peaceful demonstrations without the government being punitive toward them and preventing their basic right of freedom of speech. The Carter Center doesn't concentrate on individual countries. In our present session, we have many things going on in Ethiopia now. One of the things that we do and working it harmoniously with the government is to promote good health care. For instance, we only have one case left of guinea worm in all of the country of Ethiopia now, with about 82 million people. And in one 5-day session recently, we treated 9.4 million Ethiopians for trachoma, which is the #1 cause of preventable blindness. These are the kind of things we do.
Explain that link then, President Carter, between healthcare and helping a developing country with their healthcare, and how does that link to a reduction in violence, more accessibility to the voting process, how they're governed? Is there a connection between those two?
Well, I think there's a direct connection, not particularly between voting and good health care, but as far as human rights is concerned, which is what we're addressing, a basic human right of a person is to live in peace, but also to have a decent home in which to live, and to have adequate health care, and to have food for your children. So these kinds of things are basic human rights, just like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So all of human rights factors come under one basic umbrella. And so the whole gamut of human rights, all the way from peace to a right to assemble peacefully, is part of human rights.
Felix?
I mean, I don't disagree with that, but I think one thing that is constantly a challenge in moving forward on Ethiopia's human rights situation is that a lot of Ethiopia's partners talk about the successes in health or talk about the successes in education, and that's all fine, but that prevents those donors or those organizations from speaking more openly about the type of abuses that we're seeing today in Oromia. I mean, when it comes to healthcare in Oromia, for example, there were a number of individuals, protesters who had bullet wounds, who had broken limbs, who were denied treatment because security forces were telling health officials not to treat injured protesters. I mean, more broadly speaking, the broader context in Ethiopia, there is no way for the peaceful expression of dissent. So there's very little in the way of independent civil society, very little in the way of independent media. There's no political space. The ruling party owns 100 or has 100% of the seats in the federal and regional parliaments. And
So
the courts are not remotely independent.
Felix, these are massive challenges. How do you go about addressing that? Because it's not just about throwing up the challenges and how difficult the idea of reducing violence, stopping violence around the world, but actually, how do you do it?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, that's a very big question. But I think one thing that we want to see is we want to see the international community just stopping the silence when it comes to countries like Ethiopia. Yes, they're making progress on health and other development indicators and a viable security partner, but it really does matter that the international community condemn these sorts of brutal crackdowns. I mean, Ethiopia acts with complete impunity
So Felix,
internationally
let me
as
just
a country.
share something with our international audience here. The Human Rights Report here, such a brutal crackdown, killings and arrests in response to Ethiopia's Oromo arrest. Let me just show you the pushback, though, that came from a government spokesperson. So Human Rights Watch is saying about 400 people killed in Ethiopia protests. The government is disputing those figures, saying at least half as many as you are saying. And they also say that we believe in many parts of Oromia where the protests were quite common, security forces conducted themselves in a very professional and responsible manner. It's really important that I bring this into the conversation because we don't have anybody from the Ethiopian government to be able to have that debate with you. Let me just push on a little bit though. Malika.
Well, we heard about some of the challenges that protesters in Ethiopia face. Here's some that people in Bahrain say they face. This is Sayed. He says, we understand that the situation in Bahrain is influenced by regional factors. So that's one challenge. Another person writes in, Marty says, a big part of it is the UK and the US supply the means of repression and violence, she says, to Bahrain authorities, and then they turn a blind eye to abuses. So Ali, if you agree with those two tweets as those being some of the challenges, how then do you help combat them?
Well, I don't agree. I strongly agree because I've myself been victim of torture, and when I reported to the court, nothing happened. And also recently,
So Ali, what happened? Ali, what happened to you? You can't just say you were tortured and then move on. Tell us the circumstances.
I've been arrested in September 2010, and I've been subjected to torture. I'm forced to sign a confession that I didn't read it. And I was put in for 2 months in solidarity confinement. I didn't have any contact with my lawyers or with my family or even phone call. And when the first hearing session in the court, I've been there, I documented this allegation or my allegation of being a victim of torture, me and other 21 persons in that court. We all reported to the judge and nothing happened to that. And because of that, we have 5 martyrs dead in 2011 when the crackdown and the Saudi invaded Bahrain, died under custody. And it's been documented by Bassiouni, the committee that the king himself appointed to do an investigation, and he is an American, and nothing happened. No one put in an accountability for those who died in custody because of
Ali,
torture.
let me just share this with President Carter here. I'm not asking you, President Carter, to speak to a specific situation, but when we're talking about accountability and we're talking about ruling governments or ruling authorities, what do you do in that situation where torture, where harassment is happening? How do you address that? Bahrain is just one of many places around the world where that's happening.
One of the things that we are recommending very strongly in this session now at the Carter Center is that the United States and other major powers who are donors to these countries should not give any assistance, financial assistance or military assistance to a country that's guilty of basic human rights violations and oppression of their own people. That should be done.
That's huge, President Carter. Can you imagine what would happen around the world if that actually, if that idea actually resonated around the world? That would be huge. That would be a massive change.
Well, a lot of things we're recommending will be huge when they're implemented.
Yeah.
But we specifically have discussed the abuse of people, say, in Egypt, and also, say, in Honduras, and in other countries as well, where violent oppression exists among governments against their own people, and still the United States is very flexible in still giving them assistance of financial affairs and also military. And we don't think the United States or any other countries should do that. We should hold them accountable for basic human rights violations and punish them by withholding aid which they demand and request.
Flexible is an interesting word. Malika.
You know,
I just wanna remark that, Mr. President, that I've been tortured with an American made tools, and my people being killed with an American arms or weapons made in America. We've documented this. We posted the picture of tear gas and this. And believe it or not, Mr. President, last year the administration, the United States administration, abandoned or they allowed to sell more weapons to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, and this weapon will be used to kill its own people. You've just said in the beginning that those governments believe that they can torture their people without anybody can ask them or make any pressure on them.
Ali, allow the President to respond because we're in the last 1 minute of our show, and I would like to hear that answer. And you remember that President Carter is the 39th President of the United States, not the current President of the United States. Mr. President.
That's true. Don't have any authority now, but I think what I've just said to you is that we agree with you, and that this assistance given to abusive governments should be terminated by the United States and other major donors. That should be a requirement, that human rights be honored throughout the world, not just in our own country and those few that we mentioned today. And we also, if we had a commitment to peace and human rights, just think how much different the world would be. It's a major request and a major demand on the part of a small group like the Carter Center, but we stand behind what we say, and we're going to give our opinion to the leaders of the major countries in the world.
However unpopular it may be, Malika.
Ending thought from Aliza, who says if only governments were held accountable, then people wouldn't be violated. Makes it sound pretty easy.
And you can see what the Human Rights Defender Forum at the Carter Center has been up to by checking out this website, cartercenter.org. Thank you very much, President Carter, and also to Reverend Blackman, Felix Horn, and Ali Abdul Imam. It's been a pleasure having you on the stream, Mr. President. Until next year, fingers crossed. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.